Well, if you thought choosing a fund was difficult, there's a good reason why. It's the sheer breadth of choice and different kinds of funds out there that are available. Here to discuss this and some of the problems it can cause is Morningstar's Communications Manager, Philip Gray. Philip, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Nicole.
Let's get started with the number of funds that there are in Australia. How many are there?
Australia has about 11,000 funds for a population of about 22 million people. So that's really a very substantial number. When you compare that with some other parts of the world, the United States, Europe and so forth, it means that on a per head, per capita basis, we have a very, very substantial number of funds.
So there's quite a range of size as well in terms of members and the funds under management, right?
Yes, absolutely. And, in terms of size, they go from very, very large funds with several $1 billion in them, Platinum International's one very prominent fund, through to a great number of funds which really have a very small number of members and very small amount of money in them. So something like 3/4 of the Australian funds actually have less than $10 million in assets, which makes them pretty small.
And they've got new ones coming out each year.
Yes, that's right. New funds get launched all the time. In a lot of cases, those new funds are not necessarily new ways of managing money, but they're existing funds being added to other fund managers' platforms or master trusts.
So how does that work?
The Australian funds management industry could be described as open architecture. So what that means is that you're able to invest as an investor through another fund manager's funds, through your own fund manager's master trust platform. So if you're an investor with Colonial First State, for example, and you invest through the Colonial First State First Choice platform, that means that you can then choose to invest through that platform into other fund managers' funds. You can invest in Zurich or Platinum International, Deutsche, Macquarie and so forth.
Philip, this sounds really intricate. Is it a case that it's all too complicated?
Well, I'm not sure that it's so much too complicated, but I think it does lead to this proliferation in terms of the number of funds, and it does lead to this enormous number of investment products, many of which have very small amounts of money in them and which are arguably uneconomic for the fund manager to run.
When you say it's uneconomical, do you mean that investors are actually losing money?
Well, in some cases they will be, because the costs of running the fund will be borne by a dwindling number of investors. I think part of the problem that we have here is that, unlike the United States, for example, or even in some cases in the United Kingdom, where fund managers will merge existing funds together, we don't tend to do that in Australia. So what we tend to do is to just leave these funds sitting there. I sometimes refer to them as the living dead of the funds management industry, or zombie funds. They tend just to sort of just sit there for years on end. And I think there's a number of reasons behind that. One is that in a lot of cases, a fund manager does need to get the permission of a trustee in order to be able to wind up a fund. And if there are a very large number of investors in a small fund, for example, the trustee will need to ensure that the interests of every investor are being served by the wind-up process. So that can take some time and some effort. I think also there are some tax reasons why fund managers sometimes like to keep these very small funds still open. And there are a number of other reasons.
All right, so what really is the problem with zombie funds?
Well, I think the problem is that if you're invested in a zombie fund, an older fund which are often referred to as a legacy fund, I think there are a number of key areas that could be cause for concern. One is that a number of these funds are being run on old software computer programs, which often the fund manager has acquired as a result of taking over previous fund managers. Often what happens in that situation is that the technology and the IT staff who built the software program that the fund is run off in the first place have often gone. Often other people have come in that don't understand quite as well how to run the program. Older software programs are often subject to breaking down. We've seen a number of cases where older legacy funds which are run on legacy software systems have encountered problems with unit pricing and reconciliation of the value of the underlying assets in the funds. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think another important reason is that fund managers, I often think, are a bit like sharks. They always have to be moving forward and looking for something new. So the risk that you have is that if you're invested in one of these legacy funds that the fund manager has acquired, if there's not very much money in them, if they're not trendy or the latest thing to hit the market, then you do run the risk of being left behind a bit in terms of the amount of resource and attention that the fund manager devotes to you rather than to the latest thing that they want to get out to the marketplace. At the moment, for example, it's probably capital protected products.
Well, what can we do about this as investors?
Well, I'm not sure that there's an awful lot that you can do as an investor other than obviously withdraw your money if you're able to and move it over to a more modern fund that the fund manager is operating. I would also hope that in that situation, fund managers would perhaps waive some of the revenue that they could generate by charging you a switching fee and not charge you to switch from an older version of their funds to a more modern version.
So why do we have these constant fund launches anyway? Is it just a case of marketing?
Yeah, look, I think that there is a lot to that. I sometimes refer to some investment products that we see out there as marketing ideas dressed up as investment products. And so I think with a lot of these more sort of gimmicky funds that we've seen emerge over the last couple of years, water funds, climate change funds, and so forth, what they're trying to do is tap into the sort of wider sort of social and environmental concerns that we hear around us every day. We read about them in newspapers, we see them on television, they're the subject of, discussion at the barbecue, for example, at the weekend. So they're trying to obviously tap into that to launch an investment product that obviously is going to be sufficiently differentiated from other funds as to attract attention. The fund manager can claim that it has a unique kind of proposition to offer to investors and so forth. The concern I think that we here at Morningstar have is that some of these funds really, although they probably will make money for investors, a lot of these funds are very narrowly concentrated in terms of where they invest, so they're often not just sector funds, but they're even sector within sector funds. So what that means is that if there's a sell-off in a particular sector, for example, or if the business models don't eventuate, if the business models don't work for the companies in that particular sector, then investors are probably not going to have a very good investing experience. And I think one of the other issues of concern that we have is that a key principle of investing is diversification. Everyone's probably heard about this. So this is spreading your bets across a wide range of asset classes, a number of different vehicles and so forth, making sure you're not just dependent on one particular kind of vehicle. The problem that you have with some of these newer funds, these sort of trendy funds, if you like, is that they're actually doing the opposite. They're actually concentrating your exposure rather than diversifying it. So I would be concerned if I thought that people were investing in some of these funds at the expense of also having a more broadly based kind of exposure.
So Philip, do you think today's trendy funds are likely to become the zombie funds of tomorrow?
There's actually very good evidence that is already happening because we've already seen, for example, with a number of these funds, I think Deutsche's climate change fund is one example, where if the fund doesn't get traction, and if it doesn't attract enough assets, then sometimes the fund manager will wind the fund up. So you'll get your money back. But in a sense, that could have been a bit of a lost opportunity for you as an investor because that's money that you could have had put to work elsewhere in a more viable fund, saving and investing for the long term if that's what your goal was.
Thank you very much, Philip.
You're welcome. Thanks, Nicole.